Today, we speak with the CEO of an organization that defends and protects the ecosystem beneficial to the success of wheat growers in the United States. Stay tuned as we learn more about their advocacy efforts for the wheat industry.
Participate, engage, speak out, use your voice to be an effective advocate. The Voices in Advocacy podcast examines the diverse landscape of advocacy, exploring the ins and outs of building influence, driving change, and creating champion advocates. It's now time for the Voices in Advocacy podcast with your host, Roger Rickard.
Welcome to the Voices in Advocacy podcast, and I hope you're enjoying season 4. I'm Roger Rickard, president and founder of Voices in Advocacy, where we work with organizations to inspire, engage, educate, and activate your supporters by turning them into effective, influential advocates. And this is the podcast dedicated to the art of advocacy. This podcast is for the people that work and engage in advocacy efforts for their organizations, be they corporations, associations, trade organizations, and nonprofit cause groups. Now, let's get started. On today's show, we speak with Chandler Goule, the Chief Executive Officer for the National Association of Wheat Growers. Now, in this role, Chandler oversees their industry relations, leads efforts to advocate for the American wheat farmers. He also serves as the Executive Director of the National Wheat Foundation. Prior to joining NAWG in 2016, he was the Senior Vice President of Programs for the National Farmers Union. Chandler served as the Staff Director for the Subcommittee on Livestock, Dairy, and Poultry for the U.S. House Committee on Agriculture. Now, working extensively in D.C., he's worked on agriculture, food safety, and trade policy in the public sector for a member of Congress, as well as for numerous private sector organizations. Now, he grew up in the great state of Texas, where he was a graduate of Texas A&M University on a 4-H scholarship. He also holds a master's in political management from the George Washington University. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome Chandler Goule to today's show. Welcome, Chandler.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that excellent introduction, and kudos to Texas A&M and George Washington University.
Kudos or congratulations?
Well, congratulations and kudos to me for graduating. That's kind of how I look at it.
Wonderful. That's fabulous. Hey, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you just think of the word advocacy?
You know, the first thing that comes to my mind is somebody who is speaking on behalf of someone who can't be there in person themselves. And whether that is in body or in theory or in philosophy. And so when we say advocacy, that is me acting on behalf of someone else's best interest.
That's a great definition. And I ask this all the time, and I get a different definition each time, which is good because it shows the diversity of how people think and use the word advocacy. So why is advocacy engagement in the public policy arena so important to wheat farmers across the country?
Well, while you and I are doing this podcast right now, all of my winter wheat farmers, so that's about 70% of the wheat production here in the United States, they are all sitting on tractors right now trying to harvest the wheat that went through a severe winter drought, which we can talk about that and how we advocated to Congress and the USDA to get some help to those growers. And then all of my spring wheat growers, which is the remaining 30% of our production here in the United States, it has been so excessively wet, we're just hoping the wheat actually comes up and hasn't been killed out by moisture. And so as things move through Congress right now, we're looking at different supplementals for input cost, and we're preparing for our farm bill. My wheat growers in the 20 states we represent can't be here in DC. They can't go speak to the Senate and House Agriculture Committee, but my team and I here at NAWG, that's what we do. As a matter of fact, we're having a board meeting tomorrow, and the 20 states will be coming together and setting our farm bill priorities. And then my team and I will literally map out Capitol Hill of which offices we need to hit first, second, and third to go advocate on behalf of all the U.S. wheat growers of what we want in the 2023 Farm Bill.
It's interesting you're talking about the winter wheat. My wife's family had a farm up until just recently on the High Line in Montana that grew winter wheat all the time.
Yes.
So very, very familiar with that. What is on the minds of your members? You brought up a couple of things. You had the issues over the winter and less water than normal. But what's on the minds of your members? Because I know you listen to your members to see what's actually affecting them on the ground.
I'm getting the most phone calls and emails and text and Facebook Messenger and everything else. It's input cost. I mean, we really need to be turning and focusing on the farm bill so we can get that up there, but that's not really what's on the forefront of our wheat growers' mind. It is the cost of crop protection tools or availability. It is the cost of diesel. I know I've done several interviews in the last 2 weeks. I think a lot of people in the non-agriculture sector don't realize that diesel is the one input that a farmer absolutely cannot get around. I mean, you might be able to cut back a little bit on fertilizer or cut back a little bit on a fungicide. You may decide that you're not going to do that next pass over your field, but you've still got to use diesel to plant your crop. You've got to use diesel to harvest your crop. Then you have to drive your crop either to a grain elevator or to a miller or something along those lines. And so these exorbitant high prices, even though we've had historically high wheat prices due to the war with Russia and Ukraine, it is being completely eaten up by the increased cost of production. And I still feel that there's a decent chance it could be a rough financial year for many wheat growers, even with these high prices. They are simply not keeping up with the cost of production.
You ran right into my next question, which was how is the war in Ukraine really affecting the wheat farmers? Because the assumption is that because wheat is up, that it's a boon for them. But you've just explained some of those issues. How's it going to affect the world marketplace?
Well, the first and most important thing that the war that Russia basically threw onto Ukraine, clearly they weren't asking for this, it immediately made the U.S. wheat market very volatile. I mean, that the price, we were hovering around $5.25, $5.50. I think we'd gotten up to $6. And then the war is a little over 100 days in, and we've gone all the way up to $14 a bushel. And so I know a lot of people are looking at that thinking, hey, wheat growers are making a tremendous amount of money. And there's two things I really want to talk about on this point. The first, even though wheat went all the way up to $14, that is not encouraging wheat farmers to plant more acres of wheat. It's actually doing the exact opposite, because what it is telling the wheat farmer is that market is responding to a geopolitical issue and not supply and demand. And just as fast as that market went from $5 to $14, it can go back down to $5. And so hedging that risk of not knowing what the futures price is going to be, since it's responding to a war and not supply demand, really could be discouraging for wheat growers to expand their acreage. So I think a lot of people don't understand that dynamic. The second one, and I'll try to make this one just a little shorter, but we've got historically high food prices globally right now. And so even though your loaf of bread that cost $3.99 is now costing $4.99, still just 17 cents is going back to the farmers, to the U.S. wheat grower. So they're not getting more money back just because your food prices went up. Same example, cereal went from $4.99 to $5.99. Still, just 12 cents goes back to that wheat grower. So the war has caused volatility in our markets. It's increased food prices, but the amount of money actually going to the grower has stayed the same.
Well, that's interesting, because I was gonna kind of dive down there a little bit. Now that's twice, Chandler. You've stepped right in to where I was going to go with things. So that means we're on the same wavelength with this. So now I understand, because your farmers are harvesting right now, particularly for the winter wheat. But under other times, how do you use your grassroots supporters, those farmers, in dealing with those policy priorities? Where do they come into the game?
Well, NAWG is clearly a farmer-led organization. I have a fantastic team here in DC that represent them, but we are 100% farmer-led, farmer-owned, if you want to look at it that way. And, throughout leading up to our board meeting that's going to be tomorrow on Farm Bill priorities, we've had, 8 or 9 work sessions in our 2 policy committees, looking at crop insurance. Do we want to look for expanding it? Do we want to look at more yield products or more revenue products? How is the farm credit system working for you? Has anyone even used, a guaranteed loan from the USDA, which is still a part of our CBO score? And the answer to that's really no. No one's used those since like 2014. And so we ping things off of them so that we know exactly what's going on the ground. Because just because I've read policy that came out of the USDA or out of the Congress, and it makes sense on paper, you have actually got to take it to that U.S. wheat grower and say, can you actually apply this practice to your farm? Will it work? Because we can make things look really nice and in sync on paper, but when you've got to go put seed in the ground and grow it and harvest it, there may be logistical problems there that we need to work through. And that's why having this advocacy voice on behalf of the U.S. wheat grower and having their direct input on all of the policy and resolutions we support is how we do our job. I mean, they are the backbone of our advocacy plan.
So they have the input. I'm sure that you gather or use them to gather personal stories about exactly what you were just pointing out. What's actually happening with, with their boots on the ground, if you will, on the farm. So explain to others why personal storytelling is so important. And I'd like you to use that maybe through the lens of your experience of either being on the Agriculture Committee or working for a member of Congress. Why that resonates so much?
Well, I can tell you, let's look at it from when I was a staff director on the House Agriculture Committee. By far, some of the best years of my life. I was a staffer and got to help write the 2008 Farm Bill. And, your congressman or senator or congresswoman, they like to hear from NAWG. They like to hear from my 3 lobbyists that do a fantastic job. We're policy experts, but we can't vote for them. And so when I can go into a Kansas congressman or Kansas senator and say, my Kansas wheat grower here, Clay, here is the issues that he's having due to the drought. And this is where crop insurance is falling short. And it's even better if I can actually bring him into town. So that's why we have fly-ins each year, because the congressmen and the representatives actually want to meet with their constituents, and they want to hear how the policies they either supported or didn't support are playing out in their congressional districts. And then, of course, all that rolls back to who are you going to vote for when it comes November during an election year. And so us being that bridge between the individual grower and their representative and bringing that individualized story to the congressman or to the USDA in the White House is really how we move the needle. We're the policy experts, but it's the actual voter constituent U.S. Wheat farmer is who they want to hear from. And that's where we need that practical application of the policy that we've advocated for.
Well, and you bring up USDA appropriately, because oftentimes I think people think that the only way that you can advocate is before members of Congress, but you have that right to take that storytelling, those individual farmer stories, through the regulatory process and dealing with the different agencies, whether, through USDA or any other entity that may affect exactly what you're looking at for that particular time. Do you use that often on the regulatory side?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when legislation is passed out of the Congress, or if it's something that the USDA is already authorized to do, maybe under another farm bill, when we know they're getting ready to roll out, basically how the program is going to work, having that strong relationship, just like I do with the senators and the congressmen, I've got a strong relationship with not only the political appointees at the USDA, but also the career staff who've been there for 20 years and know how each of those programs work. And we can go in there and say, as you're rolling out this program, wheat is always unique. We've got 6 different classes of wheat. It's grown in pretty much 6 different major geographies. And so our soft white wheat that's grown in the Pacific Northwest, and our hard red winter wheat that's grown in Kansas, and our soft red wheat that's grown east of the Mississippi, all have different production issues. And so when we're rolling out a program, we need to help them develop it so that it works the best for all wheat growers and doesn't pit regions or classes of wheat against each other. So not only do we lobby to the USDA, but then I also lobby to other NGOs. I mean, I talk to the corn growers, I talk to the soybean growers, I talk to CropLife America. 90% of the time we're all on the same page. Sometimes we're not. So we advocate in many places to the administration, the White House, other NGOs, and to Congress and to foreign governments.
So all great points, and there's a lot to unpack there with a couple of things. But one of them is when you talk about regulation, if there's people that are kind of issue advocates that are listening to this podcast today, the last statistic I heard, and maybe you have something that's more real in today's world, but for every page of legislation that gets passed, I've heard in the past that it's about 12 pages of regulation that go behind that. Do you think that's a fairly accurate?
Let's see, depending on what the bill is, I think 12 might be a little low.
It very well may be. But to your point then is, how are you getting that message into the regulatory so that they understand how to interpret really what the members of Congress wanted to have done, because they wanted to fix problems that Americans have in the different areas that they're at.
You make a really good point. Can I comment on that just a second?
Please do.
So when you're writing legislation, so I'm up here with my team lobbying the Congress for let's just stick on the Farm Bill because that's coming up and it's easy. We want the legislation to be prescriptive enough that the will of the people, the will of the U.S. wheat grower, the will of the Congress is understood, but you want it to also have enough flexibility that when it goes down to the USDA and we go through this regulatory process you were just talking about, that we can make some tweaks to it so it works for all 6 classes of my wheat growers. So it's a very fine line to walk between being too prescriptive in your legislative language where you've tied the hands of the USDA, and then you can also not give enough description where the USDA basically has free will to go do whatever it wants. And so threading that needle is our job as the advocates on behalf of the U.S. wheat growers, because that's what we are trained to do, to make sure we strike that balance. And you know, it's not something you learn in school. It's you literally learn that by making mistakes. So.
Exactly. And that's why we have the opportunity to correct them with new legislation or amending pieces of legislation that already exist out there. So I know farmers are busy. I know farmers are stressed. I know they have a lot on their plate. I know that you have a lot on your plate. So how do you go out and recruit and maybe find additional advocates?
Well, you know, any problem that wheat is having, the chances that corn, sorghum, soy, rice, cotton are having it is pretty good. You know, like right now we've got this major issue with the Supreme Court not taking up the case for Bayer on glyphosate and state preemption. This is going to affect every crop protection tool that every single commodity uses out there. And so that's how we coalesce and build these coalitions to go up to the Hill. Very rarely do I have just a wheat specific issue. And so that's why having this network, to be real honest, you know, yes, I was hired because I've got a policy expert background, but I'm really hired too because of my relationships and who I know. And being able to bring in those other CEOs, I sit on the Ag CEO Council. There's 25 of us. Chris Novak chairs it from CropLife America, and then Zippy Duval, president from the American Farm Bureau, and myself co-chair it. And so right there, we've got 25 major groups and their CEOs that we speak to every 2 weeks. And we can, you know, kind of cherry pick who needs to go to what meetings and to make sure that we're representing not only the wheat growers, but all farmers.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a very effective tool as we talk about coalitions and alliances and everything else. Do you feel, and this is kind of a philosophical question, if you will, but do you feel advocacy is either different or viewed differently than government relations or public policy?
Well, that would definitely come down in the eye of the beholder. I think that advocacy has survived in a positive connotation in our daily speech and vernacular. But like in my role, I do advocacy work for the U.S. wheat farmer, but I'm also a lobbyist. And we've had several administrations, both Democrat and Republican, that have said we need to drain the swamp and get rid of all of us lobbyists. And I think that negative image has hurt the entire advocacy community, depending on which other synonym for advocacy or advocate gets pinned onto you. And so, back when they were getting really strict on all those rules of what lobbyists could and couldn't do, I can tell you for sure, I never once traveled to a foreign country and played golf. I never went on any of these elaborate trips. I mean, I did get to leave the country, but they worked my butt off. I got up at 6 a.m. and they dropped me off at midnight. And even though I might have been in Singapore, I couldn't wait to come home because I was exhausted. So I think when you're in the foundation nonprofit world, it still has a very positive image. But when they find out, oh, you're advocating to Congress, I think several administrations have done us a disservice, because I'm here representing U.S. wheat farmers. And we know when you test words in the public, farmers still scores very high, very reputable as an excellent source. And so do we need to drain the swamp? Well, I don't know how we write a farm bill if I'm not here, because we just talked about all my growers right now are in the field. So how would we advocate that message if we're not here in Washington, D.C. or in your state capital?
Well, and I think the attack of different administrations at different times on lobbyists plays to the cheap seats. It plays to the people that think that lobbyists are sitting back in the smoke-filled room with a cigar, having private meetings, doing dirty deals, and people don't realize that that's no longer the case, and that has changed very dramatically over the years. And sunshine laws have also helped that quite a bit. So what are 5 years down the road? He puts his crystal ball in front of him now, and he's looking at what are the biggest challenges going to face the wheat industry and your growers.
Well, one of my biggest concerns as we move 5, and I would even say 10 years down the road, is that the wheat industry is slowly being pushed out of the United States. Not because of our lack of love for bread and pasta and all the good things that you can make from wheat, but because the consumer still has this adverse, unfounded fear of innovation and genetic technology. And so what's actually happening when you look at where the wheat basket or the wheat footprint was in the 80s and 90s, it started in Texas, went up I-35 to Minnesota and the Dakotas, and then, went west into Montana and the Pacific Northwest. And those were big wheat states. But as corn and soybeans are able to use innovation and gene technology, we've now got corn and soybeans growing on the Canadian border. You've got 72-day corn. And that those margins, because of the RFS and other good programs like that, is starting to make corn and soy look more appealing due to their wider margin than what wheat has. And we're slowly being displaced, just like the good luck finding any oat acres in the United States. That all got pushed into Canada too. And so I'm real worried that if we don't allow innovation for either drought resistant, disease resistant, or even maybe a human health benefit, and I'm making this up, so please, I'm not a scientist, but like if we could put more zinc or antioxidants into the wheat kernel that would be transferred into the baked good, the consumer is going to have to let us make some sort of change in order to keep up with the other commodities that are able to take advantage of that sound science. Yeah.
And those challenges are big. And it's affecting the entire industry, the farming industry in general. Period.
It is, and it's not. And I know I kind of harped on our consumers, but we also have to make sure our trading partners are comfortable. I mean, Japan and the EU are not going to accept a GE event in the U.S. wheat industry. So it's not just us; it's also an international problem. We can't create a wheat that we can't sell.
Yeah, exactly. Counterproductive there.
Yeah. So
you're talking about the challenges in the industry. What's the biggest challenge for your job when it comes to advocacy as the CEO?
I think as an organization, and this goes for, I think, any organization, there's a bell curve on an organization's lifespan. And after COVID and how much Zoom and not meeting in person has taken place, I think as the average age of the farmer right now, I believe is 58, it's going up, not down. For the few young people that are coming back to their small towns and rural America and going into production agriculture, how do we make sure that we are still relevant? And I can tell you that the way NAWG was run 20 years ago would not be effective today, because the industry has changed, technology has changed, the way we communicate has changed. So we have got to be forever adapting to make sure that they have a need for us and we have a need for them, so that we're relevant in all aspects, in our advocating and in our membership.
Excellent. You're a wonderful spokesperson. You know your stuff. You communicate well. And that tells me that time is flying during this interview, because we've had just a great guest. Chandler, do you have any other thoughts or anything you would like to add that you didn't get a chance to say?
You know, the wheat industry is a fantastic industry, and we've got a lot of excellent farmers out there supporting not only our domestic food needs, but global needs through USAID and the issues with the Middle Eastern countries that are very bread heavy, and developing countries in Africa, especially during this time of conflict and war between Russia and Ukraine. And so being able to continue to feed everybody basically in the world is very important. I'd also be remiss if I didn't give a big shout out to 4-H and FFA. And you said that in my introduction. I went to college on a 4-H scholarship. My dad had passed away really suddenly when I was 15. And so if it wasn't for that 4-H scholarship, I wouldn't have been able to afford to go to Texas A&M. And so those leadership programs where my main thing in 4-H was public speaking. And so that's what I won state in. I wouldn't be here where I am today had it not been for 4-H and FFA. So I always want to give a big shout out to those two programs.
Well, and that's absolutely excellent. And by the way, I have interviewed Celia Glowacki, who is in charge of advocacy for the FFA. So when you were in Texas A&M, real quick, did you start off at Tarleton?
I did not, even though my mom told me I needed to. I went straight down to A&M, because if I'd started at Tarleton, I was going to have to live at home, and I was ready to go somewhere else at 18. Love my mom, love my family to death, but A&M was just far enough they'd have to call before they showed up.
I understand it. I did a program for the Texas Farm Bureau at Tarleton for their youth leadership there, and so I've been to that little town of is it Stephenville? Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, that's where I went to high school. Absolutely.
Well, Chandler, how can people reach the National Association of Wheat Growers for more information?
So, I mean, the best place would be on the web. Go to wheatworld.org. There you can find our links on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And then you've also got our office phone numbers. All of my staff, we're all on there. All of our email addresses are on there. And then we've even got all of our state associations who are our members. So if you're in Kansas and want to get a hold of the Kansas Wheat Growers, or you're in Oregon or Washington or South Dakota, all of that information is at wheatworld.org.
That's excellent. Well, that's a wrap of today's fantastic conversation with Chandler Goule, CEO of the National Association of Wheat Growers. Thank you, Chandler, for being on the show today and for all of your advocacy efforts on behalf of wheat farmers across the United States.
Thank you for the chance to be on your show. I look forward to doing it in the future.
Let's face it, today's advocacy arena is just plain noisy. Organizations are stretched. You need every advantage to make sure your issue gets the attention it deserves and your voice heard. The RAP Index is the best way to do just that by finding your stakeholders' relationships and engagement power. Get past the noise. Know who your people know. Go to rapindex.com. That's rapindex.com and tell them Roger sent you for a special offer. If you like today's podcast, head over to where you find your podcasts and subscribe to the Voices in Advocacy podcast. A big thank you to today's guest. I appreciate your time and the unwavering passion for advocacy you have. Well, that's it for this episode of Voices in Advocacy. Remember, you have the power to be an effective, influential advocate. Now go out and make it a better world.
We hope you enjoyed today's Voices in Advocacy podcast and look forward to you joining us again next week. To learn more about Voices in Advocacy, go to our website, voicesinadvocacy.com.